Yeah, this is another seating of the International Tribunal for Natural Justice, sitting as the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into Weaponisation of the Biosphere. I'm acting as the sole presiding judge in this particular seating, and I will ask Sasha Stone, the founder of the ITNJ and Humanitad, to act as the moderator. Over to you, Sasha.
Thank you, Chief Justice. A very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, variously, to whomever you may be, wherever you may be on planet Earth. Thank you for joining and looking in on this Judicial Commission of Inquiry. The key thing that we're focused on, as many of you will know, having watched the earlier seatings, is that we are investigating the Corona and COVID-19 theater that's unfolding around us, every single one of us. I'd like to begin this particular seating by simply mentioning something very newsworthy. In just a month, Tanzania went from having only 20 coronavirus cases recorded to 480 cases, an alarming increase, which puts the country with the highest number of cases in East Africa. However, the country's president, John Magufuli, is convinced that the number may be exaggerated due to technical hiccups with the imported testing kits. Magufuli, who holds a doctorate in chemistry himself, said the testers had randomly obtained several non-human samples on animals and fruits, including a sheep, a goat, and a pawpaw, and the results for COVID-19 came out positive. The samples were given human names and ages and were submitted to the country's National Referral Laboratory to test for coronavirus without the lab technicians knowing the true identity of the samples. The head of the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention, Africa CDC, on Thursday rejected the assertion by Tanzania's president that his nation's coronavirus tests are faulty. Well, make of that, ladies and gentlemen, what you will. I'd like to introduce two special witnesses, expert witnesses to today's Commission of Inquiry. Dr. David Martin is the architect and founder of the Global Innovation Commons and author of the International Legal Framework for the Heritable Knowledge Trust and Heritable Innovation Trust programs. He has pioneered global programs to bring corporate and stock market transparency to multinational extractive industries, and has been instrumental in repatriating value to countries which have been subject to corporate and financial abuses. His work on ethical engagement and stewardship of community and commons-based value interests is at the forefront of global financial innovation. Dr. Martin is a Batten Fellow at the University of Virginia's Darden Graduate School of Business Administration. He served as Chair of Economic Innovation for the UN-affiliated Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Organization, and has served as an advisor to numerous central banks, global economic forums, the World Bank, and International Finance Corporation, as well as national governments. Dr. Martin recently posted a video which has gone tremendously viral, stating an official allegation of violations of the US Constitutions and civil and criminal acts pertaining to the COVID-19 fear tactics. Dr. David Martin, a very, very warm welcome to you, sir.
Sasha, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and I look forward to presenting the information that I hope will benefit not only this inquiry, but the world.
Thank you, David. Our second speaker today, witness, is Dr. Aaron Lewis, who is an educator, entrepreneur, pastor, and champion of social causes. He has earned 7 degrees from leading world universities, including 2 PhDs. He has authored over 160 books, translated in 20 languages, selling over 33 million copies. In addition to growing the community in Connecticut, where he was born and raised his 5 children, he has traveled extensively to over 61 countries, impacting lives all across the globe. Dr. Lewis ran for mayor and is very versed in the legal rights of the state versus the rights of the people. No time in history has the state ever told people that they could not gather for religious reasons And Dr. Lewis feels very strongly about the roles the church leaders play at this most critical moment for humankind. He speaks out loudly against the controlled opposition strategies being played out on the people with the current coronavirus situation and the impact of the fear propaganda being perpetrated on the people, which will ultimately play out for years to come on local and the global level. Dr. Aaron, you are most welcome to this Commission of Inquiry, sir. Thank you for attending.
Thank you, Sasha Stone. I'm extremely excited about being here at this forum and hearing, and also very, very eager to express knowledge to pastors and spiritual leaders everywhere on the planet of their roles in this hour. It's a very, very crucial time to be completely aware of what's happening and not to be overcome by the media, by the social platforms, to reducing the voice that, if not heard in this hour, will be silenced forever. And so right now we have the most important role, I believe, I'm a little biased, but on the planet, to influence the masses everywhere, to not just our rights as citizens of nation states, but citizens of what we believe and what we call the kingdom of God. And we have to, and we're all a part of this, and we have to show what our rights are by demonstrating them, and if necessary, defying laws that stand in direct contradiction to what we believe God wants us to live as. And so I'm here to encourage the planet, the globe, to stand up for their rights.
Thank you, Pastor. Beautifully stated and greatly appreciated sentiments. Finally, I'd like to just reintroduce to the court Paula Woodley, the United Nations veteran nurse who was recently commissioned to New York to join the U.S. Navy hospital ship contingent. And welcome, Paula, and thank you for looking in today to give us a brief update, not least due to the fact that I believe that your last hearing that you gave to this judicial inquiry has been deplatformed by our friends who control the social media platform YouTube. So thank you for being here, Paula, and please, in 4 or 5 minutes, would you kindly give us the update that you're bringing to the table?
Thank you, Sasha. I'm really pleased to be here. As a matter of fact, it's National Nurses Week. So I would also like to commend all the nurses who have gone forward to support everybody here with the COVID-19 projects. It has been a challenge, and I'm here basically to exploit the truth. And basically, again, our intent is to expose any crimes against humanity and to protect the society. And we're here again to basically demystify all of the falsification of information that has been out there. And as a nurse of 40 years, that will be my mission.
Very good. Thank you, Paula. Greatly appreciated. Dr. David Martin, if I could turn to you, could you please take as long as you need, give us your synthesis of the status quo as it relates to 7 billion people spinning on this planet?
Indeed. Thank you, Sasha. And as this is a judicial inquiry, and as I did, in fact, get the privilege of studying constitutional law, not only at the University of Virginia, but as I have right behind me, the law certificate of my grandfather, William Parsons, who was notorious in arguing for the people's cases, particularly when it came to transportation issues in his life. I find it interesting that he's somewhat looking over my shoulder in this moment of our new encounter with the opportunity to pursue an inquiry into facts. And I'd like to do something that is, I think, part of decorum, and that is to read into the record a couple of documents which are exceptionally important and unfortunately are preserved in ways that are almost inaccessible to the public. But if one wants to truly pursue the facts that lead to what we currently call what I call COVID-19 branded campaign, it's important to read the record that begins with 2001. And most of you will be shocked when I say 2001 because we were told that SARS started in 2002. But the federal funding for coronavirus, chimeric, and genetically modified organism mutations and amplifications started in 2001. And the official start of that started with a series of grant numbers that I'm going to read into the record so that anyone who wants to do fact checking can go back and not only look at the information, but unfortunately, if you read these grants, you find that most of what we've been told lately is in fact categorically false. You will see in each one of these grants data that supports the fact that since 2001, there's been an active campaign to try to take a naturally occurring substrate of what is considered to be a strand of RNA and modify it and amplify it for the purpose of increasing its virulence. Those grants include grant GM 63228 and A123946, two grants that resulted in the issuance of United States Patent 7279327. That patent was specifically the direct outcome of the work done under the grants starting in 2001, which was specifically done to produce an infectious strain of coronavirus explicitly. That is what the research was for. That is what the research did. And the resulting patent held by the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, was in fact a patent derived from work done to effectively, to use terms that are consistent with the work of this tribunal, weaponize the biosphere. Very recently, just anecdotally, before I go further, I want to also make an observation about the fact, and I'm going to come to this a bit later, but I want to read something that just came to my attention today. The statement made by an official commenting in the journal Nature said, the debate comes down to how informative the results are. The only impact of this work is the creation in a lab of a new non-natural risk. That is a quote. That's not my quote. That's not somebody else's. That is published in the journal Nature from Richard Ebright, a molecular biologist and biodefense expert at Rutgers University. So, setting the stage for this, I think it's important to understand that the very nature of the human interaction with what we call coronavirus began in federally funded research by the United States in 2001 and specifically sought to amplify and weaponize a naturally occurring protein strain that was amplified through the RNA associated with coronavirus. That's 2001. Additional grants that took place before any of us have been conducting thoughts or inquiries in the main were grants AI 0185524, grant AI 0157157, grant AI 0107810, and two U19 and U54 grants, resulting in patents including patent 7618802 and patent application 2016-0238601. Now, the reason I'm entering these documents into the official record is for a very important reason. This information contains the evidence that says that infections in humans resulting from or contributed by coronavirus are not only commonly known and well documented, but specifically the mechanisms whereby the coronavirus reportedly interacts with the human cell, were mechanisms not only identified, but specifically amplified over not only moral and ethical obligations of the fact that this represented a non-natural risk, to quote the gentleman from Rutgers, but more problematically, it represented a situation where there was an alliance that was being formed, where the mutation of a coronavirus became an economic incentive for very specific organizations to work in collaboration. And this is where I'm going to take us on a journey starting with the illegal patents filed in 2003 by the Center for Disease Control and by the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, both who sought to and ultimately received patents, specifically identifying strands of nature in violation of 35 U.S. Code Section 101. Pursuing and receiving a patent on nature is illegal. Under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 of the United States Constitution and its international equivalents, inventors are entitled to access proprietary rights and patents, or copyrights, on things that are in fact works directly derived from their creative input, and they are explicitly prohibited under every law from patenting nature. Nature is not to be patented. It cannot be patented. But despite the absence of all moral supervision at the United States Patent Office and at international patent organizations, both the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill and the Center for Disease Control, a part of the Department of Health and Human Services, procured and obtained patents on nature and then did something more insidious, and that is they patented the means by which you could detect the presence of coronavirus in a sample. Now, what does this mean? What this means is effective in 2003, the public would have had to infringe on illegal patent rights granted to the Center for Disease Control and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill to confirm or deny any allegation of any statement about any coronavirus from 2003 forward. By effectively controlling the means of detection, by prohibiting anyone else from doing independent verification, the foundation cornerstone of the conspiracy was laid in 2003. Subsequent to 2003, a number of organizations acting in violation of 15 U.S. Code, which is the antitrust laws of the United States, and their international equivalents, selectively identified and selectively obtained relationships that conveyed economic benefit preferentially among the co-conspirators. Rather than being an open and free and open society question of saying, A, is coronavirus something we should concern ourselves with? B, is there a way for us to detect and mitigate it? A small group of individuals elected to control and remove the option from the public of independent inquiry into the coronavirus and its potential pathogenicity. What makes this particularly problematic is the fact that that collusion was done using US taxpayer and international foundation and corporate sponsored research in excess of $485 million between the period of 2003 and 2013. Now, I'm going to leave for this particular inquiry the fact that several of the things I'm going to reference are in the public record. For example, I'm not going to recite every one of the components of the allegations that I have made in my previous videos, but I will highlight a few things. First, the Center for Disease Control, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, the P3 program funded by DARPA, which included Vanderbilt, Emory University, and the Wuhan Institute of Virology, have for many years been continuing their research into not only the identification and detection of coronavirus, but have specifically been working on amplification of the spike protein and on the receptor binding domain regions, which are the interaction sites between the virus and the human cell. They have been doing it specifically to amplify the pathogenicity. Now, the argument being made by them, in fairness, I try to be as level and fair as possible, is that there has been some inquiry into the degree to which the coronavirus could ultimately be used as a vector to deliver some form of therapeutic agent. So the idea is that you could use nature, potentially, as a means by which you could infect into people some other therapeutic agent. Setting aside the moral and ethical questions associated with mutating nature to deliver agents that may be both therapeutic and may be toxic, setting aside the moral argument for a moment, which I have a hard time doing, but setting it aside, there is in fact a scientific inquiry into whether or not modifying these particular viruses might have a therapeutic use as a mechanical device to infect some other agent into the cell. Now, that's giving them the benefit of the doubt. The fact that they have specifically focused on the spike protein and the ACE2 receptor, and the ACE2 receptor is very important because the angiotensin converting enzyme receptor, which is prevalent in the lungs and prevalent primarily in the kidneys, are two locations where we know that high degrees of interchange of other body fluids and other cell matrices actually come into contact with one another, which means that if you can find ways to amplify the infectivity of a particular virus or strain of viruses, you have the ability to, both for good or for ill, significantly alter the way in which the human body is made to respond to the natural occurrence of pathogens in the ecosystem. We have an immune system that is made to understand the types of information contained in the RNA of viruses. That's part of who we are. That's part of our evolutionary makeup. Part of what gives us an immune system is the fact that we have the ability to encounter and to process through exposure to a number of pathogens. That's part of who we are. That's part of our makeup. But when we modify and specifically engineer aberrant forms of both proteins on the outside shell of a virus, as well as the receptor binding domains, we are playing with something that the human body is not prepared to deal with. The human body was never prepared to deal with engineered viruses. It was never prepared to deal with, as I quoted from Rutgers, a non-natural risk. Now, I'm not being a fearmonger. I'm merely reporting an important fact that says that the suggestion that science, left to 2 or 3 individuals on this planet, has thoughtfully considered the moral, social, and biologic implications of building super viruses is beyond the pale. And we as a society cannot stand for this type of recklessness. In 2013, that wasn't my opinion. In 2013, and I encourage people to look for this, it's very difficult to find. I'm holding in my hand the actual letter that was sent from the Department of Health and Human Services and the National Institutes of Health to every single researcher conducting chimeric research. On October the 21st, 2014, after the National Institutes of Health had determined that their concerns were that chimeric viral research was potentially breaching ethical and moral limits that had been unconsidered. The letter that was sent said that the United States government had announced that it was going to limit or prohibit what was called gain of function research. The actual letter sent to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill contains, unfortunately, the following paragraph, which I will read into the record. as your grant is currently funded, this pause is voluntary. Did you hear what I just said? We've determined that what you're doing is potentially unethical. We know that the patents resulting in this are in fact illegal and violate the not only 35 U.S. Code Section 101, which outlaws the patenting of nature, but overrides the Supreme Court determination in Myriad Genomics in 2013, which explicitly stated and confirmed that viral or any other DNA patents of nature were illegal and not allowed to be pursued. This letter sent from the Department of Health and Human Services from the National Institutes of Health states, not only is your grant currently funded, the pause is voluntary, organizations conducting gain-of-function research supported by the NIH have an opportunity to transition the applicable research to research that is not covered by the funding pause, halt the applicable gain-of-function research until the outcome of deliberative process is known, or continue to conduct the applicable gain-of-function research until the current ended period. Now, what makes that a problem? Beyond all of it, what makes that a problem is that the way in which these grants were funded and remain funded were an evergreen process under what was called the U54 and the R01 program. In other words, we had a public statement that was a public statement to be the fig leaf behind which we hid when we questioned the morals and ethics of doing this type of research. But rather than actually standing for those morals and ethics, rather than backing the public's concern that said that this was unethical and potentially illegal, the researchers, as long as they had a preserved economic interest, were allowed to continue violating the moral and ethical standards in 2013 and 2014. Now, not surprisingly, coming out of those funded research programs were the mutations specifically linked to the bat coronavirus, which not surprisingly was going to come into feature in the latter part of 2019. Every single one of the research disclosures from 2014 and following, from the labs associated with the gain-of-function research, specifically used as their model and their prototype and referent the bat coronaviruses that have somewhere between 90 and 96% homology to what is being called SARS-CoV-2. And here's where I'm going to get very precise from a scientific standpoint. Well, the phylogeny of the coronavirus that is associated with what is called SARS-CoV-2 allegedly has some degree, depending on who you're reading, somewhere between 200 and 300 mutations from the previous clade of coronaviruses. What we know is that no scientist has the ability, nor have they undertaken the question of whether or not any of the mutations are material. We do not have, in any scientific publication, in any independent inquiry, and in any inquiry not associated with a propaganda campaign of summarizing literature reviews, we have no evidence that SARS-CoV-2 has any unique pathogenicity. What we do know is that there are certain mutations, but we also know that within SARS-CoV-2, since January, there have been 229 documented mutations, meaning that the notion that somehow or another, that somewhere in December or January, a new virus emerged is patently false. There is not a single piece of evidence to suggest that a new virus exists. What is very clear is that there, in fact, are a multitude of viruses. To be specific, there are 39 identified that have the genetic makeup associated with what we call the SARS coronavirus, which is just the sudden acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus, that virus that has the ACE2 and the spike protein that create a pneumonia-like symptom. Now, let's go into the more present moment just to get ourselves grounded. In February, Dr. Anthony Fauci of the National Institute of Asthma and Infectious Diseases, Allergies and Infectious Diseases, Dr. Anthony Fauci and Ralph Baric, the two individuals I've identified as co-conspirators since 2003, who have maintained the control over both the coronavirus and its detection and potential therapeutic implementation. The two of them lamented in an article that was reported in STAT that funding for coronavirus research was unfortunately unreliable because it ebbed and flowed with outbreaks. Now, that seems like an innocent thing to say, right? That it's a shame that, people get interested in coronaviruses and then they don't, and then they get interested and then they don't. The reason why that particular article is so problematic is during the period of time that that article was being written and published, Dr. Baric sat on the committee, the International Committee for Taxonomy of Viruses. And he was on the committee that determined, number one, that this was a novel coronavirus. Number two, that based on one study, only one study published in China, which hypothecated the potential virulence with no evidence of what was going on in China, came to the conclusion that violated the ICTV existing protocol by stating that we were going to manufacture both a novel virus designation as well as a novel disease recommendation. To put that into context, when the Middle East respiratory syndrome broke out, MERS, as we've been told to call it, broke out in 2012. It took from the discovery of the virus that was associated in all likelihood with camels. It took from the discovery of the virus infecting humans in 2012 in Egypt. That same committee, 3 years to conclude that the virus was unique and novel, and to conclude that there was a proper name for that condition. That same committee, who desperately pleaded with the public to justify pouring more money, not only into their research, but more problematically into the pharmaceutical interventions that they were directly participating in which they had material benefit, they decided that it was important that we both name the virus and name a disease. What makes this problematic is a very simple fact. They named a thing that did not exist and could not be independently verified. There was no means by which, outside of the conspirators, there was no means by which independent testing could be done. That is because they controlled the means of testing. Furthermore, the testing that they reportedly did could not distinguish between every strain of coronavirus. They've made no allegation that they can, and there is no evidence that they can. And when it turned out that what was considered to be atypical pneumonias were increasing in prevalence throughout the winter months in the Northern Hemisphere, a tragic decision was made which ultimately indicts this entire exercise as a complete fraud and crime against humanity. Because what was decided was that for the first time in any of these outbreaks, the determination was made that no test confirming the presence of the virus would be required to state that someone in fact had either acquired or had resident or suffered from or died of the actual virus. COVID-19, the brand, was meant to embrace not only people tested with the virus, But COVID-19, the brand, was meant to embrace anyone presenting an idiopathic pneumonia, fever, or any other symptom. Now, I'm not going out on a limb to suggest that the record keeping at the Center for Disease Control had a pornographic obsession with trying to run up the numbers to terrorize the population. Because it turns out that if you only looked at patients that had positive tests for the presence of the virus and presented clinical symptoms, somewhere between a half and a quarter of what was reported would have been even included in the clinical population. And if we look at the actual comorbidity data that is coming out, we see that the likelihood that the virus actually was proximate cause of death to anyone is probably somewhere between 5 and 10% in the most aggressive scenario. Meaning that this entire campaign of terror was created specifically for the purpose of reinforcing the financial interests and the direct economic gain of the co-conspiring parties. It was directly benefiting a series of pharmaceutical companies and vaccine manufacturers, most notably, by the way, Gilead Sciences and Sanofi, the two companies that hold the most proprietary control over vaccines and therapies to treat coronavirus infection. Those two organizations not only benefited richly and were enriched by this declaration, but unfortunately, both organizations cannot extract themselves from the fact that they are in fact inextricably linked with the very individuals and organizations that declared this to be a pandemic in the first place. So we have an economic interest creating the outbreak. We have an economic interest creating the fear and pandemic. And we have an economic interest that is diverting public funds to their own economic self-interest to go into therapies that we know have been around for a long time. Remember Gilead Sciences Remdesivir, which Anthony Fauci, after mysteriously Gilead Sciences nearly doubled its lobbying budget in the first quarter of 2020, mysteriously Remdesivir became the agent of preference, despite the fact that there was no evidence that this was preferential to any previous documented treatments, including the August 2005 publication of the fact that chloroquine was perfectly fine in terms of treating previous coronavirus outbreaks. Despite all of the evidence, no effort was made to independently verify the independence of any of these things. And at the end of every scientific publication, from January until the present, each author has stated unequivocally that they have no financial interest in the research and the positions that they're taking. That is a patent lie, evidence in every one of the documents I've presented. And with that, I'm going to rest, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Dr. Martin, thank you so very much. That is the most compelling, I'm not permitted to say evidence, but certainly alluding to the most compelling body of evidence I think we've heard in one seating thus far. Thank you for that. And we'll be reverting with some questions shortly. I'd just like to put the very same to Pastor Dr. Aaron Lewis. If you'd kindly, Pastor, give us your own summary of the status quo. Take your time, please.
One of the things that is tremendously concerning to me, and I'm speaking specifically from the area of faith-based organizations, churches, mosques, synagogues, temples all over the world, is how this initiative has caused people to completely disregard and abrogate what we have long held as a higher power, a higher truth, a higher authority, based on no reasoning whatsoever. No research has been presented to any one of the clergy. No research has been presented to any of our governors here in the United States that gives proof, documented proof, that what is happening right now is harmful to the general public. There's been literally not a shred of evidence, and yet we see churches all over the world, all over the United States, that have literally shut its doors, and the exchange has been, well, listen, you guys can stream. And so what concerns me from a church sovereignty position, of which most pastors have no clue what church sovereignty means, and I don't say this facetiously, I'm starting to wonder if they even understand what we believe to be the sovereignty of God, because the way that they blindly submit to government without any level of backing is very, very concerning and unnerving. And so the issues have been that we've now transferred the way that we worship, not because of a mandate from God. If God told us to worship under a tent, or or tabernacle, or move from one place to the next, or if God told us to sit under a tree like the Buddha did, whatever God says to do, we do. But when government gives the direction of how we worship, how we function, what we do, what we don't do, not only is it a violation of government and a tremendous overreach of government, but it is actually a violation of our duty to the God that we claim to serve, because we don't take those directives from the federal government. But if what is being said is something that government does not agree with, now they have direct control and direct access to shut down the voice of the church immediately. And so the problem with this is that, personally, I believe that this is all intentional. And I believe that the design was strategically created by great internet minds, great computer inventors, great network minds, to have control of one of the last voices of freedom outside of our individual freedoms, and that's religious freedom. I believe that this was designed to control the entire narrative. And so we can't control the church in their church. What they preach, what they say inside the church is their prerogative. It's their interpretation, or very well their misinterpretation of scripture. But nonetheless, they are allowed and afforded the opportunity to do what they believe God is telling them to do. And of course, we're not trying to determine whether it's always right. Sometimes it's not right. And hopefully people will get it right in time. But nonetheless, we give people that opportunity because it is a religious right. It's our freedom. But now we have taken our freedoms, and we have now transferred those freedoms to the scrutiny of government and the scrutiny of an entire worldwide network that, if they don't agree with our position, can immediately stop our progress. That's tremendously scary. I've talked to hundreds of pastors all over the world, and the consensus from pastors, from many of them, has been, well, we need to, according to the book of Romans, that we need to be subject to the governing authorities. And then they'll say we have to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar. And what I say to them as a retort is that perhaps you may not have realized this, but we are no longer living under the Roman Empire. and Caesar has been long dead, and there's a new law, there's a new rule, there's a new day. those rules do not apply to us today. And when it comes to us being people of faith, right now, we have done something very, very dangerous, and that's we've confused the masses with regards to our responses all over the world. The masses has long, listen, and this is not a proselytizing message whatsoever. It's just a statement of truth. The masses has long regarded the church as that entity that exemplifies and portrays and displays faith in God. That's what most people see the church as, whether they agree with the tenets of our faith or not. That's an irrelevant point. Most people see the church and they say, these individuals represent faith in God. With that, that faith comes with some certain understandings. One of those understandings is that, according to scripture, is that we will be persecuted for righteousness' sake. We know that, we accept that, and it's fine with us. We'll be persecuted when people don't agree with the stand that we take for people, for humanity, for life, for the proliferation of human life values. When people don't agree with that, we're going to be persecuted. We understand that. And that's something that when we signed up for this, or when we were called to this, we understood that very well, and we accepted it as our truth. Today, we are being scrutinized now by the average person because what we historically said we believe, the government has put many pastors in a position to now look like gross hypocrites. Because if we truly believed what we said, we would continue to do what we do in order to show our faith in God. For example, with regards to even COVID-19, one of our tenets of faith is divine healing. That's a very, very strong tenet of our faith. And so our response to this would be completely opposite to a secular response, because we believe that God, who is ultimate power, has the power to heal our bodies. So that being the case, if God can in fact heal our bodies, then we would certainly be opposed to a vaccine formula that would, take wash all our sickness and disease away. We'd be completely opposed to that if we are really in the faith. But we'd rather seek God through meditation, through prayer, through coming together, through fasting, through natural means, through the reading of the Holy Scriptures, but certainly not a secular means to wash all of our sins away. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't add up. But that has now become the new narrative, the new religion. In the entire country, there have been very few pastors that have actually stood against this this entire debauchery. You have one in Florida, you have one in North Carolina, a pastor in New Orleans that was arrested. But I mean, to be able to count in the entire United States, one handful or two handful of pastors, all of which have been fooled, have been completely tricked into believing that something exists that, number one, does not exist in the way that they've told us it exists. And then secondly, that we are in a powerless position to defend ourselves against this thing. Something is very scary about that. In the history of particularly the United States, there's never been a time where every church in the United States of America, or even around the world, was mandated to close its doors. I mean, during World War I and World War II, churches were open. Just think about this. There were bombs that were being dropped around the world, yet the churches were open, and rightfully so, because people were literally going to the churches as a refuge. And so there's something that's very, very deep about this agenda, and that's what I'll call it, to completely change the way that we do life. What we've done, they're now trying to make us do it differently. And so the church's responsibility is to begin to understand what the agenda is, why we cannot co-sign to this agenda, because to do so violates our faith. But to understand that there are some things that are not just frivolous, but some things don't make any sense. They're ridiculous. And we're talking even outside of the scope of basic science or the scope of theology or the scope of, the judicial realm. Just common sense that people are not ascribing to anymore with regards to how we now behave. It's all right for us to go to Costco's or BJ's, which are large wholesale outlets where there's lots of people in those stores at one time, but we can't congregate, at a football stadium. We can't congregate in church. We can't congregate at a pub. Something's wrong with that we start believing that there are some places where we are not going to get infected, like the BJ's and the Costco's and the Walmarts. We can't get infected there. But of course, if you go to church, you will definitely get infected. Something's wrong with that narrative. And so we have to begin to revisit what Scripture mandates us to do. We have mandates from the state and from the government, but Scripture overrides those mandates. And so we still have mandates to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to shelter the homeless, right? Jesus himself says, if you've done it even to the least of these, my brethren, you've done this to me. But we have now forgotten and a completely disregarded sect of society. And what that literally means is that our focus has been on those that are COVID infected, to the complete ignoring of people with cancer, of people with diabetes, of people with heart conditions, of people with suicidal tendencies, and a host of other diseases that we now have been tricked into completely ignoring. As clergy, we don't have the luxury to ignore that there are other sicknesses right now that people need help with through prayer and medically, that the entire medical profession has completely ignored. So ultimately, as pastors, as leaders, as spiritual leaders, faith leaders, we have an obligation to revisit our mandate. For us, it is the Holy Bible. For us, for Islam, it's the Quran. For Jews, it's the Torah and the Pentateuch. But whatever that is, we have to revisit those treatises to recognize what it is that we're supposed to be doing in this hour. Because one of the things I'm very clear on is that we're not supposed to be blindly submitting to government or submitting to what I call false science. And so those are the issues that we are struggling with, but it's going to be a challenge to draw people back into, as we call it, the fold, because they're looking at most religious leaders as weak at this point, because very few are willing to stand up against government and deal with the consequences. That's what we did historically. That's what got us our religious freedom hundreds of years ago. And that's what we're going to now have to continue to do, and not be afraid and not make theological ridiculous excuses for why the government is not doing what they should do, and why the government is doing things that they completely have no right to do. They have no authority over the church. They have no authority to make any decisions or any rulings whatsoever that has to do with how we practice and promote that which we believe.
Thank you, Pastor Dr. Aaron Lewis. Very, very grateful for that impassioned testimony. And thank you for reminding us that what we're witnessing is not so much economic or even socioeconomic ruin. It's more degradation of the human spirit, of the soul. And in many, if not all cases, we're also witnessing a ritual humiliation of humankind, enforced isolation and masking of ourselves in our own homes and our own streets. You also raised another very important point, talking about these large stores staying open. Walmart has 1.5 million employees. Amazon has 750,000 employees. Kruger has 500,000 employees. Target has 350,000 employees, and Costco has 215,000 employees. Almost 3.5 million employees combined. All of these companies have not had any reported cases in the news, and yet every employee in these companies encounters thousands of people a day. None of these companies have closed their stores. That should certainly give us some food for thought. I'd like to invite Dr. Sandra Rose Michael. Sandra, I'm afraid I'm going to give you just 2 or 3 minutes, no more, if you'd kindly comment any of the testimonies that you've heard.
Yes, great testimony. I really appreciate, Dr. Martin in bringing up that study by Fauci. I mean, it's actually an NIH study in 2005, title of which was Hydroxychloroquine is Potent Inhibitor of SARS Coronavirus Infection and Spread. And so it's not like we didn't have that research back to that point. And then you also brought up the moratorium, essentially from that NIH letter, stopping the gain of function studies. And then, of course, after that, I'm sure you're aware that it looks like 3.75 million was a grant that went to the lab in Wuhan to continue the gain of function studies and to increase the pathogenicity. And of course, there's been a big attack on knowing that the hydroxychloroquine seems to stop it, and a big attack on that to bring out the remdesivir under Gilead, which it was a terrible study, not well formed, not well done. I mean, they said it was a 31% improvement. But when you look at the study and how they did it, the numbers are all wrong. It's not, it doesn't have good numbers at all. And I believe it has a price of around $1,000 versus the hydroxychloroquine, which has been 70 years of experience. And Fauci also knew about that since 2005, but then called it anecdotal. And we'll bring that up to some of the recent stats on that. There's a China study that was released, hydroxychloroquine application with severe acute respiratory distress is decreased mortality in the critically ill. They had 568 patients with a mortality of 18.8% with the hydroxychloroquine versus nearly 46% without the hydroxychloroquine. Other studies, there was the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons in a letter to the governor of Arizona, just done April 27th, I believe, and talked about the pre and post. And it was a study of the sequential hydroxychloroquine research papers and reports from January to April. The chance to cure, the success rate was over 90%, actually 91%. And looking at 2,333 cases of that. So these are just some of the studies, and that included the badly done VA study. The VA study, it was designed to fail, this VA study, that the media hype that the hydroxychloroquine was so dangerous that it was killing people. And I'm sure you're probably aware of that, but I did want to bring these things up to date a bit. The media spun, again, that the hydroxychloroquine was dangerous, we need a vaccine, and it was without the zinc. It was hydroxychloroquine without the zinc, which it is the zinc getting out into the cells. That stops the replication. There's 2 nursing home studies, one in Ohio, 30 cases, no deaths, quick recovery. Of course, it's like a $12 treatment. So, and another nursing home study was 39 patients, and that one was in Dallas area. And again, the patients were over 70. One of them was 102. One died in the 39 patients in the nursing home, but it was non-COVID related. And the rest all had no hospitalizations, no cardiac arrhythmias, which they keep talking about being dangerous to the heart. None of them have seen these dangerous side effects. And the Dr. Zelenko with 1,500 patients. And, then Pastor, thank you so much. I'm in the bloodline of Martin Luther. So this country is founded on religious freedom of religion. The Constitution, this is a violation of our rights. And you can make no law against that. The right to assemble, right to speak, free speech. And then we're dealing with so much censorship. And in the meantime,
Commissioner, I'm gonna jump in.
Okay.
I'm going to jump in now, Commissioner, if you don't mind. Thank you. We don't have that much time. Forgive me, Commissioner. Thomas Brown, could I ask the same of you, please? In 2 to 3 minutes, no more. Could you please raise any particular questions that you may have of the of our witnesses today?
Sure. Thank you, David. You were talking about like the homology, right? The 229 mutations of the coronavirus, no unique pathogenesis, and I'll have to listen to your testimony to get all these points down, but then sort of 39 sort of variations of the current so-called. So in essence, what you're saying is there is no single SARS-CoV-2 virus. So considering that, and I really appreciate what you're saying because it's the best technical explanation I believe we've heard so far on this, because we've heard testimony on the virion exosome relationships and looking at from that perspective. So a couple questions, and then I'll let you answer them all at once. One is, well, if these things are basically chimeric and could they be considered not natural and patentable from a legal point of view, but also then what are they testing for? We've looked at, Kary Mullis's, points on the PCR and following on that you can't really test for viruses. So what do you think they're testing for? Do you think it's actually valid testing? And finally, are you going to be filing on this? What sort of action are you going to be taking? Because this is very important what you're doing. Thank you. And maybe after you answer, I could get a minute with Dr. Lewis.
Certainly, I'll keep it very brief. Your second question first, what are they testing? That's a $1 million question. If you read the FDA submissions, that is not entirely clear. What they are saying they're testing for are amplified fragments of a coronavirus model. If you look at the actual material that is going into the test, it is not uniform across every test. In fact, I've gone through every FDA submission, and the fact is that they all refer to a sequence of synthesized genetic material. They are testing for a fragment. There has not been, and by the way, the only way you could actually test for the actual unique virus is to first do scanning electron microscopy, which is a very, very powerful microscope. You'd actually see the virus, and then you would actually do a genetic assessment of that particular virus. To do that is extremely expensive, and in point of fact, would be of very little value, because what you would do is you'd be very precise in identifying the virus you looked at, but that could be one of thousands of variants of the coronavirus in that patient. So there is no test for the coronavirus SARS-CoV-2. There are tests for fragments associated with it. But my problem, and Thomas, I appreciate this question because we have to get really clear on the fact that the reason why CDC liberalized COVID-19 and specifically divorced it from having to have a test is to manipulate numbers specifically for economic gain. This was specifically for the co-conspiring corporate and research partnerships and foundations, and that is explicitly a violation of commercial law. And the fact that it gave rise to the promulgation of fear-inducing numbers, as I pointed out in my video 2 weeks ago, is a violation of the Patriot Act, Domestic Terrorism Act, and its international equivalents. And both of those things were merely to incite fear in a population to effect government policy and the flow of capital. That's it, pure and simple.
Dr. Lewis, yes, I really appreciate what you're saying about the religious freedom and the status of the churches. And, sounds like you're doing what you can to basically get people awake and understand that we do have this religious freedom, this ability. So looking at this whole overall situation, I'm going to ask you probably a more metaphysical question here, since you're our pastor, is, obviously humans are at an existential crisis point. The globe's shut down. We have basically an authoritarian regime being pushed in through all this false science, which is being represented. And of course, there's a lot of people now even looking at, possibility of the vaccines coming with some sort of, embedded chip. I don't know if you've looked at it from that. I'm just wondering, do you believe, because I've spoken to some people, that they do believe that we are potentially living in the time of the Book of Revelations, and that this really is a religious battle and a religious crisis. Do you have any insight in that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's, in terms of eschatological teachings, and eschatology is basically the study of the end times. And so when we talk about end times, there are sometimes theological debates on what end times actually means, because some people believe that the end times means that this is the end of the world, as has been commonly taught, that it's the end of the world, everything's done. There's the rapture, we're caught up to meet Christ in the air. But I take a different approach when we talk about end times, rather than it meaning the end of the world, the end of all humanity, but rather than the end of an era as we know it. And that's one of the positions that I firmly believe end times looks like. And I do believe that this is the beginning of the forcing of an end of things as we know it. As I said, most pastors don't even recognize how, and I'll use this word, damnable it is to allow a governor to say, you cannot have church service, and then they agree. That is scary to me. I mean, you were talking epic proportion violation of scripture. That should have been the reason why every pastor in this entire country should have says, absolutely not. We will have service, we will convene, and we're going to continue to do so, and you can't stop us from doing that. The ease of the agreement of the clergy has sent a signal to the federal government. This was a litmus test. Listen to me. This was nothing more than a litmus test to see how easy is it for us to stop one of the most powerful institutions historically that the world has ever known, has been the force of the church. We're talking about for thousands of years. And so the church has gone through bloody massacres. The church has also done things that we're not proud of with regards to the Crusades and forcing people to come into Christianity and killing people that were Muslims. We understand both sides, but we're talking about wars that the church has gone through and bloodshed to the tune of millions of people, all for the sake of Christ. And then now we come to 2020 and I mean, in the Gospels, Paul was beheaded, right? He was put in oil and boiled to death. But now we come to 2020 and all we have to do is just say, Governor so-and-so said to shut down the churches. And we say, okay, fine, great. No pastor that I know of in this country has said to any governor, please give me concrete proof that this is really going to affect my congregation. Not one pastor. And so the powers that be have belittled the church. They've belittled religion, because now they're saying to themselves, if all it takes is for us to just say it, we can say tomorrow, you're never having church again. And then there's not going to be a retort, because if we can get away with it once, we'll get away with it again and again and again. And so are we in the book of Revelations? Well, I believe that we are, because I believe that the end of an age is definitely coming very, very fast, and that most people are so blind. I mean, every pastor should be watching this in the world, in the entire world. Every pastor should watch this. They should say, okay, fine, I'm going to relinquish my theological debates, my discussions, no sermon preparation this week. I'm going to watch this exclusively so that I can bring something back to my people to tell them that they are lied to. And we're talking about a progressive lying. They're lied to, and they're going to continue to lie to us to keep us in fear, which the scriptures clearly say that God has not given us a spirit of fear.
Pastor, thank you for that. And that does inspire a thought, and we'll pick up the conversation with you. But perhaps we can discuss with you getting an alliance of interfaith leaders to also participate in the summit. I'm sure we'd get many thousands from around the world. Our commissioner, His Grace Bishop Ria from Jerusalem, would absolutely lead the fray with you there, and we'll set that into motion in the coming few days. Reverend Dr. Nancy Ash will kindly take the lead there. Thank you for that, Pastor. Dr. David Martin, I wanted to just ask of you, if I may, as far as patenting nature is concerned, the 2003 conspiracy, I mean, God knows the conspiracy goes on a lot longer than that, the campaign of terror that's issuing. In your estimation, who is to be held accountable? Is it individuals, institutions? Who are the primary five figures, institutional or individual, that you would see in the front row of a Nuremberg-type trial? And that's absolutely what we're looking at.
Well, there's no question that with respect to the careless disregard for the potential of weaponization of the bacteria or of the virus, there is no question that Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Ralph Baric are the two individuals who persisted in every way from 2001, as I indicated before, up until the present. They not only participated in the increased virulence and alteration of nature, but the patenting and illegal protecting of those patents as part of nature. Those are two individuals. Now, they represent something, Sasha, that I want to make sure we're very clear on. Every perpetrator has one of probably several options. One is that they are the front for something. The other is they themselves are malevolent actors. And as I read the work, particularly of Ralph Baric, I see an individual who saw, like many very focused scientists, a pathogen that could be used for all sorts of things. And to attribute malevolence to that is something beyond the scope of what I'm prepared to do. Carelessness, yes. Malevolence, maybe. But it was the Department of Health and Human Services, and specifically the NIAID, Anthony Fauci's organization, which is the architect of perpetuating the illegal restraint of trade, the illegal manipulation of the flow of funds, the express conspiracies between those actors who are willing to play by his rules. I think you had Dr. Mikovich on before, another University of Virginia fellow researcher as well. I was here during her tenure as well. The fact is, the Department of Health and Human Services has been used as the front organization to promulgate this horrific act. And if you look across the period from 2001 until today, what you'll see is that they have served as a front for an enormous number of other organizations, Sasha. So it's important to understand that HHS, while being the organizing principle of the conspiracy, is only a participant, and behind them, you find both enormous amounts of lobbying from the pharma lobby. You see an enormous number of compromised congressmen and women and senators. You see compromised presidents. You see an enormous number of individuals. So as we unpack this, I'm very clear when I say this, that the individuals who are currently on camera, with the exception of, I think, Dr. Fauci, because Dr. Fauci directly bears an accountability and responsibility for promulgating terror on the public. And that is unconscionable. You are not allowed under the Patriot Act, Section 802, you are not allowed to instill fear in a population specifically for the purpose of influencing policy or for individual gain. That is illegal. And what he is doing ultimately then spreads to the governors who promulgate those rules as well. At the end of the day, there is no question that President Trump should look across the dais at Anthony Fauci and accuse him of a high crime. That crime is a felony, and it should remove him. So as we look at this, Sasha, it's really critical that we understand that there are front people, there are structural components, and then there are the agencies of those structural components, and all of that accountability is laid out very precisely in my last 4 weeks of presentation.
But David, if I could ask 5 names, I'm really trying to drill this down for people looking in. Everyone knows Fauci, and most people with a pulse appear to find the man egregious and extreme. But who are the other bad actors in this case?
Well, I think it's clear that all of the affiliations of Ralph Baric are extremely suspect. And so we need to look at his entire research organization, and that includes the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So Dr. Shi, who is very clearly very implicated in the translational work between the animal to human connection. Yeah. There is no question that the data side of the manipulation of this information has linkages both on the clinical side as well as on the data sciences side to Palantir and Peter Thiel. There is no question that Peter is involved. Now, the degree to which, once again, I'm not ascribing anything other than too many associations in too many locations where they all seem to economically benefit him. Those are things I think are very worth reviewing. And I think one of the sucker punches that I want to disavow right now is, while Bill Gates has been mentioned many, many times, I think that there is a degree to which, and by the way, I think what Bill Gates has done is unconscionable. So let's get clear on the fact that as a human being, I find what he does to be odious. But I think that what we've done is we've had him propped up as the punching bag, and he is a foil for people who know that they won't get looked at if he is the punching bag. Remember that far more money under the DARPA program went to the manipulation of DNA and RNA for vaccine programs. Far more money went there than Bill Gates got or potentially can contribute. I remind people all the time that the global vaccine program, and I mean global, I mean every vaccine produced on the globe, if all of 100% of that revenue flowed to Bill Gates, it would be less than half of his present wealth. The idea that he is somehow economically seeking this hegemony fails on the self-evidence of the fact that economically he has twice in his personal net worth than the gross revenue of all vaccine production on the planet times 2. So I think he's a punching bag, and I think, unfortunately, he puts himself there, and he's therefore punched, which I get. And I think what he's done is reprehensible. But if you look at the Baric Association, if you look at the Xi Association, if you look at the Fauci Association, if you look at the Peter Thiel Association and Palantir, if you look at the data service companies, there are 14 identified under Facebook. And all of them seem to have the same 5 institutions that all have at least 7% interest in their equity. And those organizations include BlackRock, they include State Street, they include Vanguard. And Vanguard is I think at the top of almost all of them in terms of total ownership. Those organizations collectively stand to have the greatest economic benefit. And if you look at the financial positions of those organizations, they also intersect with the top 3 life insurance companies that also are implicated in the vast holdings here. So this is a complex web of biochemistry, data sciences, and structured finance. And any inquiry, Sasha, that doesn't include all three is letting somebody get away scot-free. And I am not interested in letting one side of the issue become the punching bag, because any time we have vilified a single person or a single sector, what we find is that the real perpetrator gets away unscathed. And that is the reason why I think any inquiry must look at what I referred to in my presentation as the interlocking directorates. It is an illegal act under the Sherman Act, and the interlocking directorates are the people who benefit on all sides. So let's be abundantly clear that in our inquiry, we must examine those who are the capital and the power behind the frontmen, because they are the ones who stand to gain and will ultimately be absent accountability, just like we saw in 2008, just like we saw in 2011, just like if we go back, we saw in 2001. We cannot allow the financial institutions and the individuals supporting those institutions to get away as though they are innocent bystanders while we tear down the idol of the identity of somebody like a Bill Gates.
Okay, I think we've made that point abundantly clear, but I'm curious as to why you haven't mentioned Pirbright Institute and Kinetic in the United Kingdom.
The reason I don't mention them is because they play a bit role. They do not play the central role. If you look at the central role of this and you look at the economic, the proprietary, and the actual ties, what you'll find is that and by the way, for your event, now that you've pushed it into June, I think it would be well worth humanity's effort for us to put together the interlocking directorates map to show how each one of these organizations has common and shared financial and common and shared ownership interest. Because to Dr. Aaron Lewis's point, we can get into kind of the metaphysics of the spiritual dimension of this. But underneath of this, we also have that central warning that is in every religious tradition. The moment we build an idol, we actually do something quite harmful to ourselves and to others. And the idol that we've built is commercially financed science. Let's name it for what it is. This is not science for science's sake. This is commercial science for the enrichment of individuals at the expense of the public. And it's high time we name the idol what it is. And I agree entirely with Dr. Lewis's assessment that what we've done is we've supplanted one God for another. We've decided that the statistical test of significance of 0.005 is now the altar upon which we sacrifice our children. And that is ludicrous, and it must be called out. And I think we have the time, if we have until the 21st of June, to publish the interlocking directorates so that no rat doesn't get seen when the light is shown.
Indeed, and not dissimilar to the way in which in the recent years we see statues of Baphomet and Molochite worshipping being unveiled in town squares and in city squares. Dr. Martin, the interlocking directorate map, that is something presumably which is going to very clearly define the public health administration chiefs in every nation on earth, correct?
Yep.
I mean, every signatory to the World Health Organization complex.
No question.
Okay. All right. And so as far as the World Health Organization is concerned and the directorate there, I've been a former director general at the United Nations IGO sector, and you've also played a significant role there. Who do you hold accountable? The Secretary General of the United Nations, the President of the General Assembly, who is effectively interposing on the alchemy that takes place on the General Assembly floor, and that is a very important position, or the head, the chief flunky or technocrat at the head of the World Health Organization?
Well, I learned a long time ago, Sasha, and you and I both have had our experiences in this environment. We know that the people who are heading those organizations are put there because of their compromise, not because of their qualification. The fact is that the donor states and the donor organizations are the people who put those individuals in place. Accountability is associated with the structure, indeed, But at the end of the day, accountability is a snake whose head is only fed through the funds that flow into it. And we need to make sure that we get the funding sources that put those individuals in their positions. I have an enormous respect for the fact that hosts of individuals have made horrible decisions in their life. And I think the Director General and Secretary General, and I think the Director of the World Health Organization have made horrible personal decisions in their lives. Just like I think, you know, the Imperial College folks made horrible decisions in their lives. Those decisions, I come from a long line of people where the guilt till presume innocent kind of dynamic has to be preserved. And my view is that this is a situation where almost every name we see, and Sasha, you and I have been through this before, but every name we see put up in front is a stooge to be torn down. These are the idols that we want to be able to attack. And what I want to do is make sure that we go to the root of the tree. This axe must hit the root. It must not hit the branch. Because this axe, if we are going to be serious, must implicate and must hold accountable those individuals who put weak and compromised individuals in positions of alleged power, knowing that they will in fact receive the blows while the individuals who did it will once again get away. And so are they compromised? Yes. Are they flawed human beings? Without question. But the individuals directly responsible for this are those individuals who put compromised people in positions of power.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. Couldn't agree more. And I will also add, David, that it's, I think a decade thereabouts since you and I were doing our work at the United Nations. And it hasn't gone unnoticed to me that the chief bad actors that were around us at that time, and you and I were trying to do tremendous things to emancipate the world into breakthrough energy innovation, technology innovation. Yep. And you and I both came up against the forces in so doing. But I have to say that in the last few years, most of those bad actors are either arrested by the FBI and incarcerated now or dead. And that has not gone unnoticed to me. Thank you, David. Paula Woodley, we're coming to the end of this seating, but I wanted to give you 2 minutes, I'm afraid no less, and I'm going to be a strict headmaster moving forward. If you could just give us a very brief update on what's happening on the front line in Manhattan, especially as it relates to a doctoring and nursing of this diabolical corona outbreak with the millions of bodies piling up in the ports and in the docks and in the hospitals. Please give us your own 10 cents.
Okay, well, first of all, I just want to say I've come to the conclusion almost like that the truth hurts and we have no more freedom of speech, and we are at war, and it was like a war zone. And I think for several reasons, I would like to point out a couple things that are very important. We do have nurses out there are doing the best that they can. We are limited because there is a standard of care, which we discussed in our prior meetings. The standard of care, we want to know, is set by the pharmaceuticals. We do everything that we can. If we question it, what will happen is, I was in the field hospitals. I've talked to nurses that are in the hospitals. The nurses in the hospitals there's videos out there. They've been taken down. These are credible nurses that have no reason whatsoever to lie. You can't make this up. You see a patient, they need help, you try to help them. And this is strictly what their goals were. I'm a nurse of 40 years. Basically, again, this is the truth. Nobody should be sanctioned or held more or less disgraced because they tried to help their patients. What people don't know is that in New York, there are doctors, and I worked at the United Nations, and I know many doctors there. And when I was in New York, I've had doctors I've entrusted. Doctors now are doing telemedicine. And they are actually telling the patients not to go to the emergency rooms, if you can believe that, because they know that they will be intubated. What people also need to know is that if you do go to a hospital, you do have a way to protect yourself. How? You better make sure that you have your advance orders in place with the DNR. because right now there are cases where people are going and they're not having the proper paperwork with the POA, but if they have that to protect them, they do not need to be intubated. This is where they're catching them. They're leaving it up to the patients and saying that we have no recourse because of the fact that they're not doing the protocol, like giving them proper oxygenation, doing medications, bronchodilators to basically stabilize them. And that is, again, as I said, the last resort to intubate. So what's happening is that they are intubating these people, but if they had a DNR in place, they wouldn't need to be intubated, okay? There's things that are going on, which I won't even get into, with saying that they can't find the POA. Police are even being called, basically police to try to protect these patients. You know, families are calling them. It's a complete chaos. Also, we have another issue that in order to try to contain this virus, okay, we actually, first of all, just keep in mind, we can contain Ebola in 2018 in a third world country, but we cannot contain a virus in this country in this day and age. We need to question that, okay? But there are also HIPAA laws, which people are not aware of. What is HIPAA? It means that you do not need to disclose what your diagnosis is. That occurred, as you know, about in 2003. What has happened, that was basically for people who had chemical dependencies or other things at HIV that they didn't want to disclose for personal reasons. However, when you go into a hospital, what people need to know is that when they leave, they do not have to disclose to anybody that they have COVID. How can we contain a virus or communicable disease when you don't have to, basically disclose that? The last thing I just want to say is that, as you know, we have more than 30 strains now. We also were seeing in the last week's clots, okay? Is clots related to a virus? Seriously? Do we see that with the flu or anything? People were getting clots. So you have to question that. So the course of treatment plan was always changing because we have to look at medications, the modality of treatment based on what the doctors, top doctors in New York had told me, these employees or these patients' medical histories. So if something's going to work for one person, it might not work for the other based on their history. The last thing is that I'm concerned too, which we talked about, I'll make it really short. If they're getting these clots, there's been papers out there to say, is this all being a detonation of a virus that's activated by the 5G? Because, you know, we saw what happened in China, we saw what happened in Milan. But again, that's not a topic that I need to address because I'm not that expert, but I think there's a lot of other factors here that are acting as a catalyst basically for, as you know, this virus. The last thing that I just wanted to point out was, yes, it was sad. It was very sad. Why? Because we are dealing with a couple other factors here. Some of the factors are the psychosocial. As the pastor had indicated, people do have problems before. We have created now a lot of problems. There are children on the streets crying. They don't have food to eat. They don't have their parents. The school chantry is coming in trying to help these children. Where are we going to get the money to help these kids? Do you realize that there's people like you and me that you can't imagine living in subways, living in the streetcars, underneath the streets? These are things that nobody even addresses. There are factors regarding how the funeral processions are being done. The bodies are being held in semi-trucks, put onto an island where people are not able to put closure on it because of the fact they're, basically kind of like concerned about the exposure. So, you know what? Funeral processions are being done drive-by to their houses, okay? That's how they're doing it. So the psychosocial impacts, along with having a disease here, because I have a degree in psychology, is above and beyond what anybody in the world could even imagine. So we don't have just a disease, we have a complete planet that has been crippled and paralyzed. So what does happen then? Anything could happen when we are in the state that this country and this world is in right now. And it's very saddening.
Paula, thank you. Thank you very much for that. That does paint a terrifying picture. And I think what we take away from that is that from your point of view, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, this is orchestrated pandemonium, orchestrated havoc. So when you talk about the bodies being shipped off to an island, are you talking about enormous amounts of bodies? Are you talking about a normal kind of death syndrome from the annual influenza? What bodies are we talking about? How many people actually died?
There was articles actually in the New York Post that actually hadn't hit the mainstream media, but I have those articles and we can basically find those for you. But obviously these are semi trucks after the people have died that they were put in 3 50-foot semis, okay? Then those bodies were brought to Hart Island. That's where they're buried, okay? Some of them are even brought on forklifts. These are COVID patients. Now, basically, these bodies have not even been embalmed. They have not been embalmed. And now they basically are on this island, Hart Island. The bodies have not even been claimed by the family because they're afraid of the exposure of the COVID. Okay, so these are COVID patients that have died, that have not been embalmed, that their bodies are right now. I mean, there's thousands of them on Hart Island, thousands.
But they're COVID-19 deaths,
yes,
or they are ascribed to being COVID-19 deaths because of very, very flawed and faulty testing, which doesn't work at all or works a little bit. Does anyone know in your profession?
Well, the problem is that, as we know also, is that the COVID now, every patient is labeled COVID, okay? All patients are basically labeled COVID. The testing itself has been faulty.
Fruits and animals. Fruits
Exactly.
and animals in Africa. Yeah.
Exactly. And then also the testing has been faulty because there's kits and we're not doing serological blood tests like the PCR test. And those are probably one of the most accurate. And another problem is that when we have people in a hospital, that's why many of the doctors in New York, top infectious disease doctors, are telling them not to go into the ER because it's a petri dish, basically. And when people are even in nursing homes and they try to get out, what will happen is that they're not even COVID testing these people when they leave that are non-COVID, okay? And they are in a COVID environment. So how can we contain, epidemiologically wise, any handle on this virus if we are not taking the safeguard precautions to make sure that people are being properly quarantined, and the fact that they don't have to disclose that they have COVID means that anybody could be walking around and they are legally protected by the government, that they have a HIPAA, okay, a HIPAA guideline that will protect them. I cannot understand how HIPAA can oversee what a federal pandemic would be for not disclosure. Did people during the tuberculosis days not disclose that they had TB? Did polio, was that hidden? We have also a hidden agenda to protect them so they don't have to disclose. And that's serious, very serious. A lot of people don't realize that.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you very much. And Pastor, I'm going to put my last question to you. And Thomas raised some of the biblical references or apocryphal story narrative earlier. I wanted to speak to you about Revelation 13 and 14. Many interpret this as the Bible speaking to prophecy, speaking to the beast emerging, and the beast of the two beasts emerging, in point of fact. One being a beast from the sea and the other being a beast of the earth. Are you familiar with that particular narrative? And if so, can you make a distinction between the beast of the sea and the beast of the earth as you see it?
But one of my particular interests and studies merges traditional and orthodox theology with metaphysics, and so that's a little bit different than most clerics, because I've studied and proficient in both. And so when you talk about the sea and as well as the earth, of course the traditional translation speaks of the beast emerging from the sea, a land type of beast. And a lot of scripture, for the most part, has been very much Hollywoodized over the years to pretty much take away from what the real plausible interpretation might be. When it comes to the sea, there's a study that I've personally committed to that has to do with the actual chips that are from the sea sand that comprise our entire computer and data system, of Silicon Valley. And so when we talk about the beast being from the sea, it to me, through years of study, has far more to do really with what Dr. Martin was saying, not just one person, but a conclave of co-conspirators that clearly are using this computer mainstream network to control the minds of the people. So when we talk about the beast, I believe it's very, very much active and alive in the world. The problem is, and I really was excited about what Dr. Martin was saying. It resonated with me insofar as never look to one as the only, because what you'll do is then, pretty much diffuse the power that we have to really deal with this demon. I was recently criticized, and I was proudly criticized as well for referring publicly to Anthony Fauci as the seed of Satan. And I got so much negative backlash for saying that. And they said, well, how does a cleric call anyone Satan? And I said, it's probably the same way that Jesus Christ did when he identified it. However, in calling him the seed of Satan, I'm clearly making it known that he is not the only seed. He is one of many seeds in this collaborative effort to blind us to reality. More recently, within the African-American diaspora in America, as well as abroad in the UK, there has been a clearly politicized effort to convince Black people that white people want to kill them. And I shouldn't be smiling, because it's sad that this initiative even exists, but the whole idea is that every state that's claims that they want to open up the state, they want to get back to commerce and business as usual, those are the states that want to kill Black people. This is the narrative that's being pushed through the churches, and it's very, very politicized. And so now the powers that be, once again, has said, we're going to do what we've done historically to distract and detract from the point. So we're going to cause a stupid race war, and that's what I'll call it. It's a stupid race war that has nothing to do with anything that we're dealing with right now. So we're going to pit one against the other while they build their kingdom even stronger, while stupid people are fighting one another.
Thank you. Division and conquest. Division and conquest. A tired old imperial game. Thank you. Thank you for reducing it to that, because that's exactly what it is. Pastor Dr. Aaron Lewis, thank you very much indeed for your testimony today. Very, very meaningful to us. And Dr. David Martin, the same. Thank you so very much. I'd like to thank Commissioner Dr. Sandra Rose Michael. I'd like to thank our trustee, Mercy Wolf, and trustee Reverend Dr. Nancy Ash, and trustee Thomas Brown. Of course, you, Paula Woodley, thank you so much for your testimony again today and the update. And also I'd just like to briefly thank Chris Fern and Imani Mamalushan for producing this particular hearing. Sir John, Chief Justice, please would you make any comments you wish to, and then formally close the proceeding.
But thank you very much, Sasha. I'd just like to comment on something that Dr. Lewis said about the prohibition on people gathering. God is with them, and that's been prohibited. In Australia, we've just finished Easter, and the Catholic churches were closed, the Church of England was closed, the Uniting Church was closed, Scots Church was closed. They were all closed. And at about the same time period, Passover came, and a group of people of the Jewish faith got together, 15 or 16 of them, and said that it was so important in the Jewish faith to congregate and be together for Passover. And the response of the civil authorities was they sent the police in and arrested them all. So,
wow.
I don't think it's just a crackdown on religion. It also prevents people peacefully getting together in civil disobedience to them. So if Gandhi was alive and in Australia at the present time, he wanted to lead a peaceful protest against everybody would be arrested. And the latest news today that everybody who has a telephone, mobile telephone, should lodge on to a particular application. So in the interests of protecting the public against the coronavirus, they could track them down and know who they spoke to. 5 million Australians signed up, and now the government is considering making it compulsory for everybody who has a mobile phone to have the application there. So in the interest of protecting them, the government will be able to track them down, who they spoke to, they are, where they're moving. So that's what we're moving towards. I've described it publicly as martial law because the rights that people, certainly in Australia, have are far less than the rights that the people that were conquered by the Germans in the Second World War had. Far less than. I'm familiar with France and what happened when the Germans persuaded the French army to surrender. The French people had far more rights than the people in Australia have right now, and I think it's replicated in other countries, and it's more than sad. We're everywhere, and I'd like to thank Dr. Martin, Dr. Lewis, Dr. Michael, and Paula Woodley for contributing to this discussion. There will be another hearing of this Judicial Commission, and with the assistance of Thomas Brown, we will be able to put out a report to the public and to the governments of the world when we conclude. And we're looking to the end of June for a massive event to basically conclude that part of the Judicial Commission. And I'd like to thank Sasha for acting as a superb moderator and keeping us all in check, including me. So I'd just like to formally close this session. Thank everybody for participating, and I look forward to seeing you in the future.